In this lecture, I'm going to show you how to configure Cisco Mobility Express. So Cisco Mobility Express is on the new CCNA 200-301 exam, and the requirement is that you know how to configure it from a GUI. So Cisco Mobility Express, or CME, is a newer architecture from Cisco, and what makes it different from the older model is that you can actually designate access points as both controller and access points. So they support dual role services. So in the previous model, you had wireless LAN controllers that were appliances that were directly connected to a switch. They'd manage hundreds or thousands of lightweight access points and configure them right from the wireless LAN controller, and that's still available. And so in this example, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through and show you the GUI so you know how that works, and how to configure some basic settings. So if you're going to manage any Cisco device from a web browser, you have to set up these first two HTTP commands. And what you do is the command line interface is where they're actually configured. But with CME, what you can do is you can actually enable it automatically to support web browser access. And you would do that through the GUI instead of using commands from the command line interface. So the initial configuration, if you've got your web browser open, what would happen is the master AP advertises a SID called Cisco Air Provision, and so your laptop adapter would pick that up, and you'd enter password. The IP address you use is 192.168.1.1 from your browser, and that would get you over to the AP for management purposes, and your laptop would be assigned an IP within the same subnet. So you'd have a wireless LAN as where you start. You start configuring wireless LANs, and they are often synonymous with an SSID. An SSID is synonymous with a VLAN, but not necessarily. You can have sometimes multiple VLANs per SID. And you set up security settings and a DHCP server. That's where the IP address is that you're getting an IP address from. And what if you want to enable VLAN tagging and firewall ACLs and QoS. So to start with, this is what the GUI looks like. So you start with wireless settings and wireless LANs. So you want to start defining wireless LANs. In this case, there's some example here, employee PSK. So that name would designate that it's for employees, it's an AP for employees, and the wireless LAN is using PSK, WPA PSK, or passphrase WIPA for authentication, and that's called WIPA2 Personal. And then there's the guest PSK as well. So you can define as many as you want. I think there are actually 16 altogether that's supported on CME currently. So there is an upper limit on that. So you just go through, you select add wireless LAN. That's the first thing you want to do. And so in the general tab, you go to wireless LAN ID. And in this case, the wireless LAN ID, you want that to match the VLAN. So if you've got a VLAN 100, for instance, a wireless VLAN 100, you'd put 100 in there for your wireless VLAN. The profile name, you want to give it something descriptive. You're going to set up a profile for this wireless LAN, give it some parameters, attributes, settings, and then you'd want to give it a SID name, and that's 32 characters maximum. Give it something like CCNA, WIPA2 or something, or you can just name it based on a description, something that the user community can make sense of. And admin state enabled just means the AP is enabled. And radio policy is all, so all radios that you've got are active would be available. And some have a single radio, some have multiple. And then you go to the security tab, and here you'd want to go through and set up either the default here is WIPA2 Enterprise, so that's their top level dynamic. WIPA2 doesn't use a passphrase, it's all WIPA2 dynamic. And radius would be, external radius is the recommended server. That gives the maximum security for wireless. And there's also local authentication as well, instead of radius authentication, local. So radius and local are two different kinds of authentications, and that's not the same as WIPA2. WIPA2 Enterprise is a wireless protocol. It's for encryption. So when you start matching these together, so you could do WIPA2 with Radius or local authentication. And here, local authentication just means you set up a username and password on the local device itself, and so that serves as just for the source for the authenticating of users. So you have a Radius-based server. You just select external Radius, and basically you have to have a Radius server configured as well. And here you go through, and Radius uses UDP, so you put in the port that you want to use for that. That's just the default. And so in the top you'd configure the WIPA2 method you want to use. You wouldn't use open because that's open authentication, so it'd be typically WIPA2 Enterprise or WIPA2 Personal for a passphrase. Then select your authentication type or source, I guess, external or local. Then you also have a guest as well. There's a guest account you can set up for configuring guests with a username and password, and that's quite popular as well. And there's the open authentication. You wouldn't typically use that. And personal is often used, but it takes a lot of management because it requires a passphrase. So use it just in, say, a branch network, for example. And VLAN tagging is if you have multiple VLANs and you want to trunk them up to a switch, you'd want to set up VLAN tagging or 802.1q encapsulation. It's just standard trunking protocol. So you just tag each VLAN and trunk them if there's multiple VLANs. And then you can set up firewall ACLs if you want to. And then you go to QoS, and QoS is per wireless LAN as well. So when you define a wireless LAN and assign a SID to that, you're going to set up a QoS level for it. And there's only 4 levels, so it's pretty basic. If you've got voice over, if you've got voice on that that you're supporting, you can select Platinum. If you've got video, for instance, then there's Gold. Silver is just for a mix of just data traffic, and Bronze would be something you'd assign to guest server, since it's just a low priority kind of internet traffic typically. And NBAR just does application level kind of QoS, so just to classify based on application. So once you go through the wireless LAN, then you go to access point. To this point, there is dual roles, so you're going to configure it as an access point. And so you go through and you can give it some descriptions like where it is, a name, location, address, the MAC. The MAC is already assigned. It's the MAC base address of the device. And the model itself is already pre-configured. So then you select the operating mode. Do you want it to be AP and controller or just AP? So in here you can go in there and decide if you want to designate it as a master AP or not. So it can be used as a controller. And some of these things, where do you obtain the DHCP? So that's where do you get the IP address from it. And in this case you could do it statically or use a DHCP server. So here you would go through and there's the model configuration, just telling where to source the IP configuration information. You could do it statically or DHCP. And as you went through here, there's the controller, and then if you've got a controller mode as well, you want to give it an IP address and a subnet mask for the controller itself. So you're doing all this kind of IP configuration here, and then you get on to kind of the radios. So in this example, you've got BGN radio, and that's based on the 2.4 gigahertz band, and you've also got 802.11 AN and AC. And N supports both bands, 802.11n, so it's actually available in the 2.4 gigahertz band as well as the 5 gigahertz band. So you go through and select enable the radio, and then the 2.4 gig, that tells you what wireless standards that is. If you got dual radio, then you select them both. or configure them both. And then you go through dynamic channel assignment. And as a controller, the controller can actually manage the RF environment. So you would want it to be automatic, so the controller could assign a channel that's available and not interfering with a neighbor. And so you don't want to broadcasting over the same channel, for example, have overlap. And so you go through there and just leave it on automatic typically, but you can in some cases select channels as well. Then channel width is set 20 megahertz for the 2.4 gig band, and 5 gig that has 23 channels. You can select 20, 40, and 8 meg channel width. And the transmit power should typically be left on automatic. 1 is the highest, and that's based, if you select automatic, it'll adjust the transmitter output based on the signal level of the receiver. So you want it to do it automatically, based on the RF environment. That would be preferred. So that's what you end up with, these kinds of settings here. This is for the BGN radio that's on board. And wireless client, then you set up wireless clients here, and in this case you've got 3 kind of options. You got WIPA2 personal, and that's actually the passphrase that would be used. Or you've got enterprise, and then for enterprise you'd have to select radius or local authentication. And you go through here and you can see the basically it's a username or a guest name, and you associate a wireless LAN profile with that name and give it a password and a description. So go through, and that's just setting up the accounts. So you go through here and they sign on with those credentials. So you do have to set up accounts for users who are using it, kind of point them to where the credentials are. And then you go on to wireless settings. What else is here? Wireless LAN users. This is just showing the graphical part of it. The username, or if it's a guest user, and the profile name, and password description, gives you all that. So you're really setting it up to match, to do it graphically. It's all security username. You're not doing anything through the CLI like you would with Cisco router, for example. It's all done right through the GUI itself. And like I said, whether it's local authentication or radius or passphrase, you just have to configure it based on, in local authentication radius, you're setting up usernames and passwords. With passphrase, you'd put in the actual key or for the device itself for that wireless LAN, and they would use that. And then for guest LANs, that's you can set up guest users as well, and this makes it easy. There's another tab for guest users, and it's just basically going through and setting up just some kind of basic things like a Cisco logo, redirect, a page headline. So this is more just some additional sort of configuration for the guest users, and that's quite popular as well. More of a customized login page. And so that's kind of an overview of CME and how that works from the GUI and the kind of things you have to know as you're going through and doing configuration. And the article is part of the lectures. This is what this is here. You can go through and it'll show you the various settings here and give you an explanation for it as well. And the security levels, what's available, and what you have to do if there's a passphrase for personal, WIPA2 PSK, or enterprise, and it tells you WIPA2 enterprise is a default and based on either a controller authentication or external radius server. So it tells you what this WIPA2 enterprise, the 2 authentications that are available. And you get authentication, local authentication from Cisco, from the lectures that talk on security and local authentication there, where you set up username and password on a router, for example. And then there's a guest security option, same thing. But it's all GUI based, so it makes it a lot easier. And then there's some lab notes as well, just some things like what a master AP is, and also you need the default system image on access points is AP mode only, cap off. So you do need to upgrade it to support controller mode. And the AP controller mode is an overlay element of Cisco DNA, so you hear a lot about overlays and underlays, and as part of Cisco DNA and their fabric architecture, and that's a lot on the exam as well. And just wireless LANs, the unique wireless LAN ID, and number of characters 32 for SID, and 16 wireless LANs per AP is the maximum for that architecture. And that's pretty much what it is. Just some other things to know as well. Master controller election, how the master AP is elected, if you got more than one, and it goes through a list here as well. And that concludes CME.